Kevin, thank you so much for having me, and everyone, thank you for joining me this afternoon. When we met back in October, I never would have imagined we would be doing this together because we were out of school. So I'd really like to start by something that I'm always honored when I'm actually in Canada, because you're one of the only groups around the world that does this. But I wanted to provide some land acknowledgement for where I live in Albany, New York. I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Mohawk and the Mohegan. Please take a moment to reflect on your region's land acknowledgement. And for past webinars that I've done, including one this afternoon with Canada, they even put in territories within the chat section. So if you want to be able to do that, please feel free to add the chat section. That will get you warmed up for adding dialogue to the session when we're together. One of the things so when Kevin and I were talking about doing a webinar today, I really wanted to be able to hone in on the program logic model, something that I talked with many of you about when I was doing the keynote, and then in the breakout sessions a little bit as well. But I will be honest, one of the things that happened for me, and while I'm talking, I'm going to give you access to that link that I gave you back in October, but here's a refresher, and I'll also give this back to Kevin so he can follow up with this as well. But one of the things that happened for me is that I had been on the road early March. I was actually in London and Edinburgh and then California, and flew home, and my life stopped, meaning that my work life stopped. And I typically travel every week. So for the first couple of weeks, I did home projects. But after that, I started getting on Facebook and social media and starting to look at how does instructional leadership factor in on things like during a pandemic. So I had been invited to a couple of pandemic Facebook pages that random people had invited me to. One was called Teaching During COVID. The other was Teaching During the Pandemic. And combined, they have 201,000 members. One has 140,000, the other has 60,000. And I remember at that point just thinking how amazing it is that within days, so many teachers and leaders converged on this Facebook page. And it just showed the magnitude of what was hitting us. It showed us how stressed we were, and that people were there looking for guidance. What do I do? Because, as many of your schools may have done as well in British Columbia, they went to pandemic teaching overnight. And I'm going to refer to it as pandemic teaching. It was something that I had read in a blog or something a couple of weeks ago. And it's pandemic teaching because in a real virtual teaching or virtual learning experience, we've had time to plan. We've had time to reflect on what works and what doesn't. And we have had time to make sure that our kids have access and that parents are involved. And all of those pieces are focused on what good learning looks like from a virtual space. We know that we did not have that luxury in many of our schools, indeed around the world. And in fact, UNESCO was talking about, they showed data that over 90% of the world's student population were finding themselves out of school. That's enormous. So one of the things that I wanted to be able to look at from the pandemic pages was I just followed, honestly, it was out of interest. I was following what people were saying. And I'm going to move on and show you a little bit about where their comments and questions ended up taking me. And it's all about the learning intentions. What I did was I took 3 pieces of research that I'll introduce you to over this time. And what I started to think about is, how does that program logic model, that easy 5-step thing that I introduced you to, how could that help us go from what is considered pandemic teaching to become more virtual learning? And I know that, Kevin said that in different districts around British Columbia, one of the things that is happening is that you are finding this hybrid program to bring some kids back, mostly K-5. But you're also talking about a hybrid program or a full-on virtual learning program in the fall, something that we're looking at the United States, Australia, the UK, where I work. So what I would like is to reintroduce you to the program logic model. And then what I would like to do is start to say, what can you do? What is your area of need when it comes to pandemic teaching that you can look at to transfer over to more of a virtual learning space? Now, social media would played a very big part in this because honestly, I was just so amazed at the thoughtful conversations going on among people posting comments, venting in some cases, which we know we do during stressful times, but just asking for help and all of those pieces. Nobody was criticizing each other. And so what I did was I actually started to cut and paste the comments and the questions into an Excel spreadsheet. And there were over 950 comments at that time. And I coded them just like we would in our master's or doctorate. But I was coding them under the instructional leadership work. Where does it fit into things like student engagement or instructional strategies? Because I work in so many different countries and with so many different types of schools, that one of the things that happens is that we get caught up in context. What is the context of the people we're working with? But part of what I want to be able to do is also step back and say, I understand the context, but now we need to look at the common theme. And that's something I picked up from the pandemic pages. I actually found that a lot of the comments were about how students were not showing up to online learning. So I wrote a blog called 6 Reasons Why Your Students Are Not Showing Up Online. And it's getting close to 1 million views just over the past couple of weeks. What that turned into is doing student surveys. Now, I'll admit, I only have several hundred so far with student surveys, and they are K-12 students from 4 different countries, including mostly the United States and Canada. So I'm going to talk a little bit about their perspective. What amazed me about that was that after I posted a blog on Student Voice and what students were telling us from the surveys, a lot of people came back to me to say, so much of what we talk about is with adults. This is the first blog I've seen about students. That's something I think we need to address and explore. The last piece is teacher surveys. I wanted to get an understanding of where teachers were during this whole pandemic teaching experience. And now I'm going to a place where I'm going to start surveying parents. So I wanted you to know what is making up this work. And this has all taken place over the past few weeks. So we know that the program logic model, at least the one that I created, is based on sort of a simpler concept of understanding our needs, our current reality, understanding what inputs or resources we need, looking at activities that could actually help us meet our needs, and then outputs, which, if you remember, are actionable steps, meaning how are we going to take those activities and actually put them into place. And then it ultimately comes to impact. And for impact, it's really about how is this going to have a positive impact on student learning. So what I want you to think of and start thinking of now, and I'm going to give you some examples of what this might look like in a little while, but under needs, I want you to start thinking about, if you think about your area of need right now, when it comes to your school or in your leadership, when it comes to your area of need, where do you think is the place that you need to start looking at to take you from pandemic teaching to virtual learning? So let's use the chat section. I see some of you are starting to utilize it. So in the chat section, it would be really fantastic if you could type in 1 or 2 sentences about where do you think your area of need is right now to take you from pandemic teaching to virtual learning. Take 1 minute to do that. Don't be shy. We need the first one to actually put something in the comment section. There we go. Now it's coming through. Let go of content and focus on big ideas and end goals. Absolutely, Donna. Clarifying essential learning in the curriculum. This is why I love working with Canadians. Darren, should I be seeing something here? Well, yes, you should be seeing comments in the comments section. High ELL population makes communication explanation of how to even utilize the tech very difficult. Yes, absolutely. So let's try to incorporate some of that in. Our area of need is building trust and relationships with students online. Absolutely something I'm going to be talking about. Darren, good, you found it. I'm glad. Social emotional needs of at-risk students, Claire. Excellent, excellent example. Whole system focus on inequities, absolutely. And like I said, when I was in British Columbia giving the keynote, one of the reasons that is always profound to me, why I love working in Canada, is that you are trying so hard to work on inclusiveness and inequities. Focus on learners instead of systems. Teacher comfort level, absolutely something we're going to talk about. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds to put that in. Having support for all stakeholders and teachers, yep. Need to develop a system that is agile. All right, permission for risk. That's something that's really important, especially when we talk about things like self-efficacy. Good, so let's take these comments and keep them going. Parents' comfort to let students meet online without judgment at home. That has been a huge one that came out through the student surveys. I'm going to be very interested to see if it comes out in the parent surveys as well. So I'm going to keep my eye on the comments as you're going through, and I want you to keep that sense of, because we're only together for a little while, keep that sense of where your area of need is, and let's see if I can help address some of them. The next question that I want you to address, and I really do, take, once again, one sentence or so, because I want to get us thinking and I want to focus on the positive. I feel like so much of when we watch news, as difficult as this is, it's a deadly pandemic and it's very hard, I think we also need to be able to focus on the positive as well. So part of the positive for us has to be what we're going to do with this experience. So what I would like is that, how is this pandemic going to help you improve on what you do as a leader? So what I would like you to do is just in 1 or 2 sentences, how is it, now that we're weeks, 7, 8 weeks into this pandemic, and you're going through the 5 stages of grief and you're getting to acceptance, how is this pandemic going to help you improve on what you do as a leader? Elaine, you're the first one to jump in. Thank you. My communication will be different going forward. I would love to know what different means. So if you could add that, that would be really great. But so take a minute. Building empathy with all stakeholders. Yep. I'm seeing the need to increase alternative ways of communication. Picking up the phone and checking in, absolutely. Frequent, open, honest communication. You almost got me in trouble there, Pam. I almost slipped up on that one. This is providing that opportunity to remove established barriers. That's awesome. I love that you said that, Jane. So thank you. Yeah, put that in. Supports the development of learning communities to build capacity, more connection, and intentional connection. That's awesome too. So let's explore these. Let's keep going through these. Thank you for adding those to the dialogue. So one of the things that happened is Pricewaterhouse and Cooper actually did a study of K-12 teachers, and they found that only 10% surveyed nationally, so this is the US, feel confident incorporating higher level technology. Do you think that would be different for Canadian teachers? Do you think that they were any more prepared? Do you think it would be higher than 10% of teachers were actually prepared for this? And I want you to think about that, because part of this virtual learning issue, even though this is from a US national survey, one of the things to think about is the fact that all this shows is that we can be very, very uncomfortable. Tanya says, I think it's pretty similar. Penny says it's similar. So thank you for that. One of the things that I said earlier that I just wanted to briefly go through, and it's just something to keep in mind, because I know that you tend to think about empathy quite a bit. Teaching during the pandemic and the 5 stages of grief. I actually wrote this as a blog too. So in that Google Doc, you'll have access to all the new blogs that I've written on the topic of teaching during the pandemic, leading during the pandemic. But we feel like we went through these 5 stages of grief, right? Denial was, there's no way we could possibly close school. We're used to snow days maybe, but not for a week. Surely that's not going to happen. And then we went into the anger stage when things started to look like they were going to shut down more. And then we were bargaining. If we just get through this and do it this way online, when I get back to school, we're going to totally go back to the way that we used to. And what we know is that teachers feel a sense of depression, right? So it's that idea of, we're so used to being an expert in our field, an expert in our classroom, then now we're in this place where it's really uncomfortable. So you go through this depression because you no longer feel that area of expertise, and that can bother us. And then we go to acceptance. How is this going to look in the fall? How can we take some of what we're learning now and move it into the fall. We know that it's not a perfect cycle. We know that people take one step forward, two steps back. But so important to keep in mind, and sometimes it's difficult as leaders to remember that our teachers and our students are going through the stages at the same time. They might have, like our teachers might have their own kids at home. We've got constant news about the pandemic. We are seeing the death count on the news. All of that can create a sense of depression. So that social emotional piece is so important for us to keep in mind. You know from being with me that these are the 6 pieces of instructional leadership. So one of the things that I wanted to be able to focus on is, what does virtual instructional leadership look like? You looked at the program logic model, and you started to think about the need. Then you started to look at what are the resources, right? And even things like the Facebook pandemic pages, looking at blogs and the research that I've uploaded into the Google Doc. Those are research-based articles that might help you be able to move forward. I've started uploading videos to YouTube. I find, especially when using Zoom, that I went to YouTube and I looked up Zoom, how to create breakout rooms. And there's a guy that just does videos on how to use Zoom. So like we have all these great spaces to become better prepared, to become more knowledgeable about the things that we are not knowledgeable about. And to be honest with you, and not sound too Pollyanna, I think it's a very exciting time to learn, to be in this deep sense of cognitive conflict. So some of what I talk to school leaders about, especially those that I coach, is it possible to join virtual classrooms? One of the things that came out in student surveys is that they miss seeing our faces. They miss seeing the faces of their peers. We're all socially isolated. It's really strange to, walk down a sidewalk and have people cross the road, go to the grocery store with masks on. So when we can get some sort of sense of normalcy, that makes us feel a little bit more calm. So when they see their principal or they see their teacher in a virtual classroom, if we can do that sometimes during the week, that would be really helpful. Foster PLC discussions that focus on virtual teaching. What's working, what's not? Let's keep it simple. How are we sure we're having an impact on student learning right now? Or what could an impact look like during a pandemic? Sending out surveys, to me, it gave me so much information, because there's something about this time where people are building a narrative. They're no longer just trying to get through something quick. I've even noticed it on social media. People interact more. Maybe they have more time at home. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they're happy for some sort of human contact. But when I sent out surveys to teachers and students, the last question I asked on both is, what's a question you wish I asked? They were so rich with the comments that they were giving. Have at least one question that involves the challenges of learning at home. I saw that some of you were mentioning the ELL population, and you were talking about access being an issue. If you know that's an issue, let's talk about some different ways that we can gain access. And I'll give you some examples of what I've seen school leaders doing. Number one is implementation. So here's the program logic model that I wanted you to see, from a pandemic to a virtual learning space. Knowing that our virtual learning experience will evolve. We're not experts. I did a webinar earlier today that I created a breakout room. And what I didn't realize is, as soon as I went into one of the breakout rooms to see what they were talking about, they took away my privileges as the host. So I couldn't even get back out of the breakout room. That's really uncomfortable when you've got 150 people in a webinar. But you know what? I know that my expertise will evolve with this, and I'm excited to learn through this and learn more, because I'll learn more about myself as a teacher. But how can we do it in a way that's going to have an impact on student learning? You can see the inputs that I have talked about. YouTube is a really great place to start looking for some assistance. There's great stuff on there. And you can tell who's credible and who's not by the number of views, and also by who's supporting it and that kind of stuff. Activities, Zoom or Google Meet, our students are asking for these, but our teachers are asking for virtual faculty meetings so they can see their colleagues and they can see their principal. Like I said, when we feel like our feet have been knocked out from under us and we're feeling that we're off balance, Sometimes when we can get together and see each other through the virtual meeting, that brings a sense of calm. Now, when I was a school principal, there were times that we went through some deaths. We went through some really difficult times. So we would all meet in the music room to come together and talk it out. And I don't know what it was about the music room. We just wanted to go to the music room and have this conversation. It got to the point where if I ever had a meeting in the music room, people were worried that something was, something terrible would happen. But the point here is that in ways that we can come together through a virtual experience, that's the best we can right now. So we need to be able to see if we can check in with people. Office hours, students were asking for more office hours. Communication home, like I talked to you about in October, I used to flip my faculty meetings, but I flipped my parent communication. And this was way before the pandemic. But what I found is that the old newsletter way, the 5-page newsletter was not working. So a 1-page newsletter that focused just on what they really need to know, and then me creating a video so they could see my face and I could talk about something for 3 to 5 minutes. For some reason, that helped people identify more with me, and parents would come to me. So communication home, we need to find different ways to be able to do it. And sometimes maybe even that old school way of picking up the phone is the way to do it. In fact, there's a poll on the pandemic page, and it asked teachers how often they called home. And there was a large percentage that said, I've never called home, I only email. That's almost like we're going to put it out there and just see if they're going to read it. That call home ups the game a little bit. A big comment or conversation that's happening now, I was talking to my editor from Ed.D, is the whole idea of looping. I looped as both a principal, we have classes that looped, and I looped as a teacher. Is that a possibility to be able to loop with our students so we can maintain that kind of communication? Now, the outputs, you can see the outputs are the actionable steps. And I want you to think about this as we're going through a program logic model mindset, and I'm talking about these different things. It's really important to kind of keep, what would this look like if you started it tomorrow? What would this look like? Oh, Penny, I'm sorry, thank you for the question. Looping is so I was a first grade teacher, and when I looped, I actually followed my first graders up to second grade, so they stayed with me for 2 years in a row. So that's what looping is. It's when a class of students actually stays with the teacher from 1 year to the next. And they usually just do it for like the 1 year. So does that make sense? So if you're their first grade teacher, they're going to stay with you and they'll have you for second grade, and then they move on to a new teacher for third grade. So that's what looping is. The ultimate impact we're going for. And when you're thinking through the program logic model, and I know you have copies of the program logic model, one of the things that you need to think about is what is the ultimate impact on student learning that we want? And many of you answered this already. You want more of a deep learning experience. So pandemic teaching to virtual learning. Here's an implementation cycle. So remember, you look at the program logic model, and then you start to think from an implementation cycle for virtual learning, what might it look like? And it's where we start maybe in our staff meetings or our PLCs or our department meetings that are all done virtually to talk about what is the purpose of virtual learning. One of the things that has come out a lot, me, is that people say this is never going to be as good as in-person learning. I absolutely agree with you. We're always going to want to be in person with our kids. There's nothing better than that quiet, the calm before the storm, before kids come in to the school each day. There's that whole idea of building the relationships with kids all day and seeing them and going through all these experiences. Nothing's going to be as great as that. But the reality is, this is our reality. And we have to go deeper, a little bit deeper, with what we're trying to offer. So this is where you use a cycle to go through and start saying, what does this look like? How can we collect some evidence to see how it's working? What do student surveys tell us about what is working and what is not? And that's a piece I'm going to talk about right now, actually. Student engagement. What we know is this. Odell did this research back in the 70s, and they found that students feel alienated from our schools for one of two reasons, or both reasons. Identification. They don't feel a sense of belonging to their school or their classroom. powerlessness. They don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning. So some of what's happening now is that these two pieces, identification and powerlessness, are being amplified in what's happening within the schools. So let's go into that. I wrote a blog on 6 reasons why your students aren't showing up. No access. They don't have access to online learning. One group that I'm working with in California, high poverty school district, their students don't have access to the internet. The school has provided them with laptops, but the kids don't have access to the internet, so that laptop's not going to help. So what they're doing now is working with local city transit, and the city buses are going to different neighborhoods for 2 to 2.5 hours at a time, and they're becoming a hotspot so kids can connect to the internet. Now, it's good for teachers to know that, because if they're doing a virtual classroom where they're doing this virtual live experience, if a child doesn't have the city bus out in front of their school, their home at that time, that child's not going to be able to participate. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. And essential workers, what we found is that there are students that actually became essential workers, meaning that they were out of school, quote unquote, and the parents said, come to work with me, we need extra money at home. So they couldn't take place in a pandemic teaching experience because they were working somewhere. No grade incentive. So what's happening in a lot of, at least, and I can tell you just from the responses on the Facebook pandemic page, I could tell you the date that schools went to a no harm grading policy, because boom, 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 there were all these posts about it. Now, it was really interesting for me to think about it this way. What happened is that schools would say, if you had an A in 3rd quarter, then you're going to maintain that A in 4th quarter. If you had a B or a C in 3rd quarter, you can work on projects that will help raise your grade. But in many cases, what happened is that when kids no longer had to worry about the grade, they stopped showing up. Think about senioritis when we were all seniors. This is just one long senioritis because they're like, I already have an A. I'm graduating or not graduating in May or June. I'm just not going to show up anymore. What this makes me think about is, are students only showing up for a grade? Shouldn't they be showing up for the learning? How can we hone in on that and focus on that? What it also was interesting for is that a lot of those power structures that we have in place as adults with kids are no longer there. You get a grade and you do the work, right? So that's gone. So now teachers have to find another way to engage students, and the grade isn't a part of that. So it's really interesting. Taking care of their siblings, because they have younger siblings, and those kids are actually doing work. So they're taking care of their siblings, making sure they're doing their schoolwork, and then those older kids are doing schoolwork at night. Bedlam, but no bedroom. What happens is we've got families, multiple families in one house or one apartment. They don't want you to see inside their world, so they don't show up. And then the last one is student and teacher relationships. If I didn't have a good relationship with Kevin, who was my teacher in an in-person classroom, and then we went to online learning, I'm not going to show up. And why? Kevin didn't really care about me when I was in his classroom, so why am I going to go to online learning? That one was really hard for teachers to be able to talk about. The loss of control, something that I had mentioned before. When we think about the program logic model and we think about our area of need, we have to think about the obstacles that get in the way of doing those activities and following through on those activities. Physical proximity to students to engage is not there. The promise of a good or bad grade, the threat of some loss of some privilege, elementary, we're going to take your recess away. All that stuff is gone. So all that stuff is gone. Thank you, David. I know Kevin's tough. So now we have to figure out, how do we engage students when all of those are gone? Why don't I engage with my teachers? Connecting to the internet, the assignments, finding a quiet place to work. These are things that students said were the issues why they don't engage with their teachers. Why don't my students engage with me? You can see where it said I did not have a positive impact or a positive relationship with the student, that percentage went way down. But look at the other ones. They have a lack of access, or parents aren't supportive, right? So, or they're not finding their assignments and those kind of things. Those are what they posted as the reasons behind this. But this was the really interesting one. And Kevin, thank you. I'm glad you do care about me. I appreciate that. You know, one of the questions that I asked of students is, how often do your teachers ask for your input? 75% of the several hundred students that I've surveyed from mostly US and Canada, but also the UK and Australia, said never. 75% said never. Interestingly enough, I surveyed over 500 teachers from 9 different countries. And when I asked them how often they asked their students for input, this is what they told me. Now, it's not that the students were necessarily in the classroom of these teachers, but why the discrepancy? Why is it that so many students are saying never, and yet teachers are saying that's not true? So maybe it's not that the teachers aren't asking for input, but maybe they don't have clarity when they're doing it. So the need for clarity and intentions is a really good thing, all right? So what the survey said, what I wanted you to be able to see, when you're looking at that program logic model and you're thinking about activities and you're thinking about what can we do to go from pandemic teaching to virtual learning, what students said is that their least favorite lessons were worksheets that just got uploaded or review. The review wouldn't necessarily be so bad if it were done in a different way. But what students were saying is that the review was the same review they had a couple of months ago. What they would prefer is maybe an activity that would take them from surface to deep to transfer learning. What they found, uploaded videos to watch that were long were not the things that they wanted to be able to see. 1-hour lectures. Some people videotaped themselves teaching for an hour and then uploaded it to Google Classroom. Students did not like that, and they were very open and honest. Favorite lessons? Collaborative activities with peers. Lessons that allowed them to engage in dialogue in Zoom classrooms. We're going to talk a little bit more about that one as we go. What this goes into is the whole idea of the knowledge dimensions that I talked to you about in October. So we know that through knowledge dimensions, there are some things that we can look at, because what students are saying is that right now their learning is really all about factual knowledge. So let's use this as an opportunity to expand on the other ones. Conceptual knowledge, where we can ask students questions like, what is the relationship between equity and the percentage of students who are engaging in virtual learning? That's a conceptual question. Isn't it good for students to know whether they have privilege or not? Is this a good question to be able to ask? This is clearly not the only one. In your Google Doc, you have access to a website that Julie Stern has done. And she has conceptual activities for parents, for students, and for teachers. Check it out. One of the things is procedural knowledge. One of the things that I saw all the time on the Facebook pandemic pages was that teachers were very frustrated that they would explain to students how to upload documents, and then the students would upload the documents and they were blank. That was clearly an issue. Came out a lot. So, you know, procedural knowledge is about teaching students how to be able to do that. So in the fall, they're better prepared. And then metacognitive. Metacognitive knowledge is about how we can get students to understand their own way of thinking. So how can you as a learner help create a more positive virtual learning experience? Do we ask students these questions? This is an example of a conceptual activity that we could have students do at home. Now, clearly, this is something that we would have to change the words on, but the bottom line is we create a case where they've got 6 Post-it notes, and then we can write different words on each of the Post-it notes, and then students have to build, they have to be able to articulate how these intersect with each other, and then they have to create a way to respond. So it's a conceptual activity to get them to understand how different things that they learn throughout the year are conceptually how they're related, and then those students have to build a visual representation of what that might look like. If we don't have grades and we don't have the same accountability standards that we normally do, then we can do these activities and not worry about them as much. Julie Stern also put this up as one of her activities. This whole idea of state, elaborate, exemplify, and illustrate. It's a way to build conceptual understanding around the same type of activity. So even if we were doing review, can we do review in a way like this that might get students to look at it from a different perspective? Or if we're now moving into newer learning, is this a great way for students to be able to go through this cognitive, this conceptual activity, which also has metacognitive elements, where they can start to talk about why this topic is hard for them. So there are loads of these on Julie Stern's websites. What I wanted to do also is give you one instructional strategy that I thought worked really well online, because this is something else that I've been thinking about. So many people see this switch overnight from in-person to pandemic learning. They have a barrier still. I get that I have more time to reflect, but it's sort of a barrier for them. And what they don't necessarily realize is that some of the same instructional strategies that are beneficial in person are equally as beneficial online. So take, for example, reciprocal teaching. You've had time to look at the screen, and we know that we put students in groups of 4, and they each have a job: summarizer, clarifier, questioner, predictor. Now imagine if you did this with these slides, and you did it through Zoom Classroom, where what happens is that you set up in breakout rooms where each student takes a job. Now, you can do that through planning, which means that you know what students need to be in the same room, or you can do that randomly and just see that each student chooses a job, and they can do it that way. So a lot of instructional strategies that are beneficial for us in the classroom can be equally as powerful in a virtual setting. So when you're thinking about the program logic model and you're thinking about all those things that you wrote in the comments, these instructional strategies are things that you can have teachers try in a virtual setting because they already might have that area of expertise around them in an in-person setting. So even though they might not feel that level of expertise online, they at least feel that level of expertise with the strategy. So that will help them. What this leads into, we know, is self-efficacy. And we know that self-efficacy is the confidence we have in our own abilities. Now, there's clearly a difference between confidence and competence. So some of those teachers that may have felt like they were ready to go with technology found that maybe they weren't as ready to go as they thought. So what the good news is around self-efficacy is that it's context specific. And just like that Price Waterhouse and Cooper statistic showing that only 10% feel confident, the reality is the biggest contributor to boosting your confidence and raising your self-efficacy is through getting over a challenging activity. And many teachers will probably never see a more challenging activity than going from in-person learning to pandemic teaching. So the good news here is that I actually surveyed teachers about this. And I asked them, I'm gaining confidence as a pandemic teacher. And you can see that 75% or more of them, and I'm still collecting data, 75% or more of them are saying, it's true, I am gaining confidence. What does this mean for you? What it means is that when you're going through that program logic model and you're looking at your need and you're looking at your inputs and you're looking at your activities and you're choosing to do the output, which is putting that actionable step in place, the great thing here is that we've got teachers that are starting to gain confidence and they're feeling like they can go through and maybe try this out more. That's going to be so, so beneficial as you go through your hybrid approach over the next few weeks. And as you think about that whole, in the fall, when you're going to become more of a virtual learning model. Now, what have I used to engage students? From the over 500 surveys, these are the things that teachers said they used to engage students. Review work was by far the highest, and probably because most school districts around the world, when we first went to pandemic teaching, said, do review work. Then you've got project-based, virtual class discussions. Here's the thing I want to say about virtual class discussions. I would be interested to know, and I wish I asked this as a follow-up, in that virtual class discussion, do students actually have the opportunity to talk? Because one of the things that came up in the student surveys was that students said, there were a few that wrote this, I wish that the teacher didn't have us on mute and we could ask questions. Interestingly enough, and I almost put this in the blog I'm going to post on Sunday, but I took it out because I don't want it to be taken wrong. But What happened on the Facebook pandemic page, one of them, was that a teacher put a meme and it said, one thing I'm going to miss when we go back to school is the mute function in Zoom. And it had 2,100 likes. So there's a clear difference between what students say, are they being muted or are they allowed to talk? And teachers talking about the mute button, because I don't mind if somebody posted that picture. I get that people get stressed. But the fact that I had 2,100 likes is pretty eye-opening. Now, sample questions. This is what I started to code at first, and this is where I started to look at common themes. How do I use that tool? My students are not handing in their assignments. I can't get parents to call me. These are literally from the past 7 weeks. Let me ask you, when you look at these questions, are they any different than questions you get when you're in school, in classrooms with kids? We so get caught up in the pandemic side and the virtual side that sometimes we're not looking at the fact that the same questions that come up are the same questions we always have to address. So when you're looking at that program logic model, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that when you're looking at activities, are you talking about what that activity looks like? I often talk about common language, common understanding. Is that something that you're building? And we also know that we can build collective efficacy by doing our virtual PLCs. And we can build collective efficacy during our staff meetings. So collective efficacy is something that can be utilized as well. And last but not least is evidence. And the evidence, and I wanted to give some examples, and then I'm going to lead a discussion. One of the things that a school is working with, one of the things that some of the schools that I'm working with are focusing on is they're actually collecting student data to look at when students show up to online learning. So there are certain school districts that have a schedule from 8 to 3, and students have 3 periods a day that they have to be a part of. And what is happening is that these schools are starting to look at how many students are engaging with all 3 periods during the day, how many of them are only engaging in 2, how many of them are only engaging in 1. And when you look at the 1 and 2, what are the reasons why they're only engaging in those 1 or 2? And can we figure that out as we move forward into a virtual learning experience? Virtual walkthroughs. You know, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that we might be in a virtual learning space for a while next year. So we might have to find, as leaders, a way to do virtual walkthroughs. So when we can go into those Zoom classrooms and see what those Google Meets look like, or I'm starting to work with school districts where our work is virtual. So instead of a full day with them, I'm doing 3 2-hour webinars. And in between each webinar over the next 3 weeks, I've incorporated Flipgrid. So I give them a question, a prompt, and then the leaders have to do a Flipgrid at a private page, and they are responsible for giving feedback to each other. Is that something that we can be a part of within as a virtual walkthrough, where we can actually not only be a part of the Google Meet or the virtual classroom, maybe teachers are using Flipgrids and we can be a part of that. So I love to see the comments going on. It says parental involvement spans the educational format. I would love to know a little bit more, Jeff, about what you mean by that. Sean, teachers are taking things more personally in the pandemic version of learning where students are not engaging with them. Absolutely. And part of that we do have to learn from. Like as an adult, if I don't get asked back to run a workshop or you know, I'm just not engaging or people are falling off the webinar, there is a part of me that I have to be able to look at and say, is it the way I'm engaging them? So even though it is personal, it's very personal, we still have to look at that because that's something that will offer growth. Because they don't have those other tools or relationships to lean on, just what they are offering for learning. I understand though, as we are all a little raw right now, I've got teachers going to homes and calling out for lawns to help support. That's awesome. Thank you, Jackie, for putting that out there. Driveway conversations have been received very well. Before, students had less choice to participate. They're voting on classes right now. And I think that that's great. So questions to ponder. And this is where I want you to have a little discussion. Then ask me some questions if you would like. What is working for your school classroom right now that can continue to be used again in the fall? That's the question that I want you to actually have some conversation around. And then we'll take a few minutes to also take some questions. But this is the first one that I want you to engage in. What's working for your school or classroom right now that you want to continue using in the fall, that you can make a part of that program logic model? Take a minute to answer that. And as you're writing, Jeff, thank you. Parent support of students engaging in their education is needed, no matter if it's classroom or virtual programs. Absolutely. And I think that's why we have to find different ways to be able to communicate with families as well. Because if something we're doing is not working, then we need to start to go in a different direction. And part of that is doing surveys to ask them what's the best way they communicate. It's actually one of the questions that I put on the parent survey that I'm sending out. So thank you for that. Synchronous delivery models, great. Group collaborative practice and implementation, a consistent schedule. Yes. Oh, that went really fast. Tanya, consistent schedule that promotes time on and off the screen is absolutely important. I have a full day version of all of this, and I use some research from David Sousa that talks about how it is not healthy to think that kids need to be online all day too. So I'm glad you said that, because I would hate to think that somebody thinks that that's what I'm offering too. I've learned better collaborative ways to reach students, especially addressing different learning styles. I made a Loom presentation for parents to explain updates and changes so they could see and hear from me along with visual. That's awesome, Tanya. That is really great. I would love, if you're on Twitter, I would love for you to like maybe tweet that out to me if you could do something like that. Teachers assisting technology, got tons of great feedback on the Loom. That's great. I'm sure you did. Who work well on Zoom are engaging, where our teachers are getting the best interaction with their students. Yeah, it was just, you know, Jeff, that's one thing that was so, it just came out so many times in the student surveys that they just, honestly, like it was both heartbreaking and heartwarming, because so many students said, I miss my teachers and I miss my friends. And when I'm reading through that, it's just like, you know, so this is that opportunity to really focus on those relationships, and then less is more, and start looking to deeper learning. Yeah, provide descriptive feedback. You know, Pam, or Parm, I love that, because you know, that's one of the things I'm trying to do with Flipgrid. It's really interesting trying to, you know, I'm trying to live everything that I'm talking about. So I'm doing this during workshops and a university course and all that stuff. Absolutely great. Honoring ongoing communication. We've also had too much coming our way. Rosa, you're right. My niece has 3 children that are 12, 8, and 5. And she said, Uncle Pete, I so love the fact that she's a bartender who's out of work right now. And she said, I so love that they're communicating with me, but at one point I just had to put it down on the side of the table, because each of her 3 children, there are different ways to communicate. And it's just, she said, it's just too much. And she had to step away from it for a little while. When students are not engaged, now teachers are reaching out in many different ways. That's right. If one thing doesn't work, then we have to find another way. You know, I feel like, come on, we can't hide from teachers, right? You know, so that's something that's really important. So what I would like it to end with, besides these, is the program logic model. We talked in the chat box about your current reality. And hopefully through this, I gave you some activities. I gave you some ideas of inputs. And we're talking about outputs, which are those actionable steps. But ultimately, what do we want the impact to be on our students? And how can we build that dialogue with our teachers? And one of the things that's coming out as a concern is that people said, well, you know, we were lucky in this case because we went out in March, but teachers already had relationships with kids from August to March or September to March, whenever you start school year. what's going to happen in the fall? The reality is we have to do the same thing. Now, I'm all over social media. I had to join Twitter in 2011 when I started writing the blog. There were people that I met through Twitter that when I actually met them in person, they came up and hugged me because it was like we were best friends. Now, I know can't do that anymore, social distancing. But the reality here is that just because it's virtual doesn't mean it can't be meaningful. We can still create short videos and upload them to Google Classroom. We can still do Flipgrid to get kids to introduce themselves and have us watch each one. There's so many of those things that we can still do. It's just going to be from a virtual standpoint. And then when we do get together in person, it can be so much more meaningful. So as always, you've got my email address. This is my Twitter address. And we have just a couple more minutes. So I love the chat section. I love what you're offering. It's really great. I wish I could actually download all of it and take it with me. But do you have any other questions for me before Kevin and I start to wrap it up?
Thank you very much, Peter. I will save all of the comments in the chat box, and I'll send them along to you so you have them as well too. And
oh, that's great. Thank you.
No worries. And so, and that will go out to our attendees as well too. In just another minute, if you have specific questions for Peter, just put them in the chat box. I'm curious, Peter. So first off, thank you so much for just such an engaging presentation. And I also have to compliment you on it was a great example of how to provide a really engaging format and pull all of the many people we have involved in the presentation. So thank you for that. So,
thanks.
And your research is really fascinating. And thank you for the work that you're doing in that. I'm curious, we've learned a lot in this era of pandemic teaching. And from your perspective, what are the things that we've learned during this time that you think we should hang on to if we ever get back to whatever normal looks like?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be anything groundbreaking that I say. I've always been a big fan of relationships, whether it was when I, started 3 months. I mean, I officially started as a principal on July 1st, but when I started in April after I got hired, studying the yearbook, going to the school one night a week after I was done teaching in another school district, creating relationships with kids and parents and adults, like that, those are the things that I think we value. To be perfectly honest with you and not be too sappy, I am on the road. I used to be on the road so much, right, Kevin? That's something we talked about. But I've been home for about 7 weeks, which is the longest I've been home in 6 years. I love it. I love being home. And my mom's 86, so she lives an hour north. So I go up and stay with her one night a week because I'm only here, or I'm going up there, and I try to be safe around her. That whole idea of reconnecting, she lives in the house my dad built. So I still I still jog around the roads that I used to run on, but now I jog or walk or hobble. And it's been nice to reconnect with those kind of things. And I think reconnection is going to be something important. And I also feel like when we go through a traumatic experience, and for many people, this is a traumatic experience, we find the best parts of ourselves when we can dig down deep and find out how is this going to make us as a leader. Because quite honestly, when things are easy, it's easy. But when things are hard like this, we have to dig deeper and we can find out some really amazing stuff about ourselves. So I would say that the overall for me is the relationship piece, the idea that we don't have to do all of those activities within a classroom, that we can do a deeper sense of learning. And the one thing we have to do is we have to focus more on trying to elevate student voice in our classrooms, because just from the surveys I've collected, they have so many great things to say. And we can learn from that. If we can get over the personal stuff where it might sting a little bit because it's the feedback, those are the things that I think we have to continue to take away. And and thank you, I'm glad that you love all of the research I'm doing. I have to be honest with you, it has renewed my excitement when I'm writing blogs. It has renewed my excitement when I get up in the morning and I'm checking out all these responses. It happened kind of by dumb luck. And it has been a really nice way for me, because I always have to figure out, where do I fit in to the greater picture? How can I help? What can I do? And all of this has just been really inspiring for me to look at.
Well, Peter, this has been a really inspiring session for me, and I'm sure for all of our participants. And I can't thank you enough for your time. I think that's a great way for us to close off our session. So, to all of our participants, thank you very much for participating today. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Peter. I look forward to the next time we can connect again and learn more about your work and your research. Um, and at that, I will bring our webinar to a close and remind everyone to go wash their hands.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Bye.